This week we conclude our look at the hermeneutics of suspicion by tracing the development of what is often called postmodernism from its roots in the work of Friedrich Nietzsche to its final form in the work of Jacques Derrida. Nietzsche is perhaps most famous for his claim that God is dead. The underlying idea, of course, has its roots in Christianity, where the death of Jesus, who is regarded as both true man and true God, is seen as a means of atonement for humanity's sinfulness, or as an example of fulfilling the law unto death, thus paving the way for human connaturality with the divine. But this is a death followed by resurrection. Sometime early in the 19th century, German philosophers began using the phrase God is dead to describe the process of secularization, the declining influence of religion in modern society. When Nietzsche took up the phrase, he used it in this sense, and especially to refer to the impact of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment on the centrality of the idea of God in Western civilization. No longer grounded in divine reason and or will, traditional morality had lost its basis, leading to nihilism. Nietzsche claims, at least, that his philosophy is a response to this nihilism, an attempt to transvalue all values, and thus save Europe from self-destruction. Specifically, Nietzsche argues for the embrace of humanity's interworldly creative potential and of the will to power that we share with everything in the universe. Indeed, for Nietzsche, the universe is a will to power, and one ultimately doomed by physical laws that require everything to die and all events to perpetually repeat themselves. Nietzsche calls this the way of the Übermensch, or Superman. The idea was later reflected in the ideology of National Socialism. Martin Heidegger develops this line of reasoning further, arguing that the death of God is also the death of metaphysics, or what he calls ontotheology, the attempt to explain the universe through a comprehensive deductive system, like the one which gave birth to the ontological, cosmological, and teleological arguments. Being, he argues, is not discovered or proven to exist, but rather manifests itself in a people only through the voice of the select few who help discover its God, a sort of mythos under which being is revealed. Here are some quotes. The essence of the people is its voice. This voice does not, however, speak in a so-called immediate flood of the common, natural, undistorted, and uneducated person. The voice speaks seldom and only in a few, if it can be brought to sound at all. Further quote, a folk is a folk if it receives its history through the discovery of its God, through which history compels it in a direction and so places it back in being. Only then does it avoid the danger of turning only on its own axis. Heidegger's view at once continues the work of the hermeneutic of suspicion, rejecting the whole project of ontotheology, and also begins turning it on its head, insisting on the inevitability of something like the religious, even if there is no God in the strict metaphysical sense. In Heidegger's case, the connection with Nazi ideology is quite explicit. Heidegger was a member of the Nazi Party and looked to Hitler to catalyze a new unveiling of being. While some contest the claim that his philosophy is organically fascist, the idea of a people being constituted and receiving its identity through the word of a prophetic leader, an identity which is not subject to rational scrutiny or demonstration, has obvious authoritarian implications. A similar critique of ontotheology was mounted by the Jewish philosopher Emanuel Levinas. Levinas shared much of Heidegger's critique of Western philosophy, but argued that Heidegger's continued use of the language of being perpetuated the effacement of the other in the interests of power and domination, which had characterized the whole Greek philosophical tradition, which he refers to as ontology. In its place, he advocates a new metaphysics rooted in encounter with the radically other, the victim, in which alone we can discover, but never conceptually possess, God. This line of reasoning has been taken up by Latin American liberation theologians, particularly Porfirio Miranda and Enrique Dussel, and more loosely and eclectically by others for whom the encounter with the poor and oppressed becomes the unique, privileged hermeneutic key for reading the scriptures and reality in general. This line of reasoning reaches its completion in the work of Jacques Derrida. In Violence and Metaphysics, Derrida develops his position dialectically, accepting the Heideggerian critique of all earlier metaphysics and Levinas's critique of Heidegger. But he then goes on to point out that Levinas as well is unable to escape what he calls the violence of metaphysics. In finding God in the face of the other, do we not efface the difference and specificity of the other as surely as if the other were reduced to a necessary expression of the divine first principle, an object of divine providence, of a vanishing moment of the human historical process? What Derrida suggests is that violence is unavoidable. There is no escape. The best we can do is to unmask the violence embedded in our own discourse and that of others in an effort to contain the damage. But this in turn creates a dilemma. Why bother to criticize violence? The answer to this question forces Derrida to recognize that there is ultimately something which is undeconstructible, the demand for justice. While specific ideologies which claim to promote justice can be deconstructed and shown to be instruments of oppression, this is possible only because of the standard of justice against which they are measured. The result is something very much like what the older theological tradition called the via negativa, or negative theology, a path to God which proceeds not by affirming things, for example, that the definition of God as perfect includes its existence, or that explaining why there is something rather than nothing requires something which has the power of being as such, but rather by denying things, for example, the adequacy of any historical ideology or social structure to the standard of justice to which such ideologies and structures appeal for legitimation. The result looks a great deal like classical Jewish approaches to the question of God, especially approaches associated with the Jewish mystical tradition of Kabbalah. Where do you stand? Do you think that the idea of God is dead in modern society? If so, is this a liberation, as Nietzsche thought, or a cause for despair? Is it a purifying development that by purging us of the idea of God will allow us at long last to come face to face with the divine? I look forward to your responses.